Hello, everybody, and welcome to A Day for Adventure, the premier outdoor podcast that will get you off your butt and outside. I'm Ben,
I'm Will.
And I'm Trevor.
and in this week's episode, we'll be diving down the rabbit hole talking about everything you need to know about one of the most important tools in any outdoor adventure, knives. We have to start this off with the question of why are knives so important? Well, the answer is very complicated, but essentially, knives are one of humanity's oldest tools that has been so universal that it's still relevant today, even thousands of years later. So, we use knives every single day for all sorts of tasks, from opening letters and packages to cooking our food to cutting wood and all sorts of things we do in our daily lives. Knives are really a jack of all trades tool. It's basically the be all, end all, can do everything, not the perfect tool for everything kind of tool. I always like to think of it as the ultimate placeholder for everything. So, in the context of an outdoor adventure, as we always like to put this into the context of, there are a couple big things that we generally will be using knives for. For example, you might be carving stakes for your tents. You might be cutting rope or twine. You might be gutting a fish or gutting game or cleaning game if you are a hunter. If you are in need of opening a can or something like that, knives generally are a great tool for that. Food packages that are tricky to open, a knife will always be able to get into. Whittling, cooking, scraping pots out after somebody burns stuff on the bottom, right? Sparking fires. The list goes on and on and on for all sorts of things that you're going to be using a knife for.
Now, since knives are extremely useful, it's important that you invest in a good knife. Luckily, there are a ton of different styles and ways and designs that you can have for your knife. Unfortunately, that also means everyone prefers something different, and it can be difficult to find the right knife for your needs. However, we're going to be going into some of the main ideas that you should consider when buying a knife.
Alrighty, first things first is a knife is metal. So it's made out of something metal, and knives use steel. There's usually two specific steels used, either a carbon steel or a stainless steel. And we're going to go over each of them and some of their pros and cons. So we're going to start right off with our carbon steel. That one's been around probably the longest, probably about 1,000 years. So it's made from iron and carbon, hence why it's called carbon steel. There's also sometimes trace elements of like chromium and magnesium. It's also a much cheaper material when it comes to knives. It's very strong and corrosion resistant. What else? But it also requires greater care, and it's really good for like heavy use stuff because it's going to hold up. So if you are going to use a knife, like you have a knife as your daily carry, or even if you're going on an outing where you're going to use your knife quite a bit, a carbon steel knife might be a good choice. And if you require to have higher and longer performance, and what I mean by performance is like your durability and your edge retention and balance on hardness, this would be a good choice for you. Also, if you're just on a budget, it's not a bad choice either. Stainless steel is much newer compared to carbon steel. It's been around for about 50 some odd years. This one has higher concentration of chromium in it, and that's what just makes it different from carbon steel. It's more expensive just because it's newer, it has different elements in it and stuff like that. It's also more difficult to sharpen. So you're going to be spending more time at your. I have a whetstone that I use to sharpen knives, so I'd be sitting there for a longer time just trying to get an edge on my blade. But in exchange, it has much higher corrosion resistance, and it's a lot more hygienic. So you'll see it used in medical stuff or cooking stuff. And because it's so corrosion resistant and hygienic, it requires a little less care than a carbon steel blade would. And it's best used for your, again, like I talked about cooking and medical, for delicate tasks. So gutting a fish, all of those fillet knives are usually stainless steel knives. So this would be a good choice of knife for you if you want something that is a little bit lower maintenance. If you're going to buy like a pocket knife, a lot of them are stainless steel. And if it's like your first knife, your first personal knife, like an outdoorsy style knife, and you have a little like less experience with it, stainless steel is a good option. So I just want to quickly touch on the knife that I have, and I actually have it directly in front of me. I bought this probably my second year in the Boy Scout program, and it's a stainless steel. It's a 440A, so it is a stainless steel, but it has a lower carbon content, which makes it a little bit softer than other ones, and therefore it's easier to sharpen, which was one of the things I was looking for. Easier to sharpen than other stainless steel knives, I should say, because as a young scout, I was bad at sharpening and I needed something that would last. And I still have it now. Like, there we go. That's the click. It's my favorite knife, but it needs to get sharpened again, and it has a nice little dink in it, which makes it harder to cut certain things because it gets caught on that. But again, it's an old knife by this point.
So now that we've talked about the types of steel that you'll find in knives, we now have to start breaking down like the main types of knives that you will generally find when you're trying to buy your own knife. So we're going to break this down into three types that are going to be very broad categories. We're going to talk about fixed blades, folding knives, and multi-tools. Okay? So we'll start off with fixed blades. So think of it like a kitchen knife. If you've ever seen a kitchen knife where it kind of the steel of the knife extends past the handle, that is generally a fixed blade knife. A folding knife is a knife that basically has one single blade or maybe two or three singular blades that basically are just housed in a little handle section, right? It'll pivot around one point or something like that. And then a multi-tool would be pretty much any tool, if you will, that is like, for example, a Swiss Army knife that has multiple different other tools on the side as well as a knife. So let's start diving into some of these types. So before we get started, I just want to kind of say I am a pretty big fan of fixed blades. It's not really because I have a ton of experience with them, but more because I am kind of a bit of a knife snob. I kind of am, I'm sorry. But I'm going to try and look at all of these relatively objective. So, first of all, let's talk about fixed blades. So, fixed blades are going to have really four primary advantages over all of the others that in my opinion, make them better. But that's just my opinion. So, first of all, let's talk about ruggedness and strength. So, because a fixed blade will generally have what is called a tang, which is basically a bunch of steel that extends behind the handle. So that means that you have a lot more physical strength. There's no mechanical anything. It's nice and easy. That means they're going to be a lot stronger in general, meaning that you can carry something and beat the crap out of it and it will still hold up pretty well, which makes them very, very good for situations where you're going to be beating the crap out of a knife. So simplicity, you don't have any mechanical aspects to a knife that is a fixed blade. You don't have any extra like things you have to do. You don't have to oil a mechanism. You've got all of those kind of things that make it a lot easier to just kind of care for and use on a daily basis. It's easier to sharpen in some case. Sometimes it's easier to sharpen, and all those kinds of things are due to the fact that a fixed blade knife is really just like stupidly simple. Now, the third thing is something I think that is a bit more debatable, and it kind of goes into more of my knife snobness, which is control. So generally a fixed blade knife, because you've got metal stick or that goes into the tang, or it goes behind into the handle, you generally get a much more balanced knife, which means that you can get a lot more control, which in turn means that you can carry a larger blade than you maybe normally would and still get the same amount of control. For example, my folding knife I carry on a daily basis is a 3-inch blade, and it's about as controllable as a 5-inch blade fixed blade or 5-inch bladed fixed blade that I have used on very few occasions that I've built. it kind of goes to show that, controllability, my knife, which is a Kershaw Leak, which is a very, very balanced folding knife, by the way, is still not as controllable as, say, a 5-inch bladed fixed blade. So control is kind of a big thing. That balance point gives more control in general. Finally, there's the cost for quality aspect, and this kind of goes into a knife that I just recently bought for work, but it's the idea that essentially, because you don't have to deal with any mechanical stuff, the cost of production of a fixed blade knife is a ton cheaper. So that means that you can, for like $10, for example, I bought a Mora 511 on Amazon. I bought it for $10, and it's made out of a pretty strong carbon steel that, price to performance wise, will outclass any folding knife within about $30 or $40 in physical cost, because a fixed blade is just so simple to build from a production standpoint, which means that your cost for quality is just a lot better. Now, of course, I also have to say that there are a lot of cons, and there's a reason I don't carry these all that often, and why I don't have a ton of experience with them, and that is, first of all, size. So the physical size of a fixed blade is just kind of impractical. They're very difficult to carry because of it. So that means that although they're, in my opinion, better, they also kind of suck for that same reason that they're good. Because you don't have a mechanical aspect that will keep the blade short or keep the whole profile short or small. You have to carry it in a sheath, which is bulky and weighs a lot. So even though, actually, from my experience, a fixed blade can weigh just as much as a folding knife, with a sheath included, it just doesn't really work out in the end. So if you're looking for something light, a fixed blade is not the way to go. Also, it kind of goes into the final aspect, which is kind of the more social and the practicality with fixed blades, and that is that it's really, really hard to justify carrying a fixed blade for quote-unquote daily stuff. It really is. There's really no justification out there when a folding knife or a multi-tool could do the job 1,000 times better. On top of that, if you are carrying a fixed blade, there's a looking aspect to it. So honestly, if you're going to be doing a lot of outdoor stuff, fixed blades are great. But if you're going to need it for more than just outdoor stuff, don't get a fixed blade.
It's an important comment that some places, either they're campgrounds or universities that you may be doing outdoor activities with, may place limitations or may even flat out ban fixed blades. I know that with scouting, it's looked down upon, with some camps and troops individually banning it. And I know at least with my college, fixed blades are kind of given the side eye, as knives in general on a college campus are at least considered questionable in what they state in like the student community standards. So you just keep it where you're going in mind if you're going to be using a fixed blade.
I agree. That is a very important part about fixed blades. That is a big disadvantage of them.
The next one we're going to talk about is folding knives, which is my personal favorite. And thank you, Ben, for going first. So now I have all the perfect rebuttals to tell you why folding knives are better. So the biggest pros, just building right off that, the modern applications of a fixed blade, is that pocket knives are seen as a little bit more acceptable. They're also a lot easier just to keep on you. Because like I said, my pocket knife that I just talked about earlier, is my daily carry. I have it on me almost all the time, unless I know I'm going to a specific place that's like, hey, no knives, even if it's just a tool. I even go to a college campus that's kind of out in the country. It's surrounded by farms. So they're totally chill with me just pulling out my knife in physics class to cut some rope or something like that. We were using string for one of our experiments, so that's the biggest thing. Another pro is its size. It's a lot smaller than a fixed blade because, well, it folds. The knife blade goes right back into the handle, so it literally cuts the size in half sometimes. And so it's easy to pack for outings. It's easy to keep in your pocket. And then it can also be a little multi-purposeful. I think most knives can be, but my greatest example was yesterday. There was two things stuck together, and you just get the tip of my knife in it and just pop it out, which, depending on how stuck they are, is a dumb idea. But this one was pretty loose. I just couldn't get my fingers in between it. So that goes really for all knives. But since a fixed knife, or a folding knife is always on me, it's my go-to for that. Um, so going into the cons, since they are a little bit more popular, the more you pay, the higher quality you get. So, like I said for mine earlier, with all the materials in it, mine's considered a cheaper one, and that's why I have to work more on sharpening it a lot more often, or trying to work around this little notch that got knocked out of it. I have a little ding in it. So again, because I paid a lower price for mine. The ruggedness and simplicity of these knives are kind of compromised for their practicality. Sometimes, again, it depends on how much cost you put into it. There is a little bit of reduced control because they are shaped very different than a fixed blade. A fixed blade, their handle is more rounded, fits to the hand better. My pocket knife has a nice handhold for my specific hand. If you had a bigger hand, it might not work as well, but it's still flat on all four ends. Really, there's a few curved parts, but it's all flat, so it can fit places better, like a pocket, as where your fixed blades are rounded and they just fit in the hand a lot easier. So you just have so much more control over it. Sometimes they can be heavier, not all the time. It depends on which ones you get because your fixed blades tend to be longer knives as well. But when you're comparing them with the same actual blade, so if they're both, say, 4-inch knife blades, then the folding knives tend to be heavier because all of it's metal, including the handle, where some of your straight blade knives are wooden handles or something along that point. But you can also get super light pocket knives because you can get those little 1-inch, 2-inch blades that are just tiny and you can keep wherever.
And the final type of knives we're going to be talking about are multi-tools. And these have both a blade and additional tools attached. Think of your Swiss Army knife. These make them multi-use and are good multi-purpose tools in addition to being decent blades. These are the ones I personally recommend when you're just starting out, since they have, you can do a lot with very little. However, there are a few big issues with them. The big one is that while they do a lot, they don't do them at their best. Your pocket knife, screwdriver, or file are not going to be as good as an actual screwdriver. Your blade's not going to be as good as a fixed blade or just a folding knife in general. They also take a bit more maintenance since you have to focus on cleaning and oiling the hinges of all of the tools and not just the blade. It's very easy for grit or sand to get into it and really ruin the tools. Additionally, they're heavy. If you're doing more long-term backpacking, having just one multi-tool per group works, but it's not everyone should have it at once. And they are also not as comfortable to use. A folding knife or a fixed blade are more comfortable to hold. You tend to get a bit more control. The blade quality is generally better. They're usually sturdier. And also, some multi-tools don't have locking blades, which, if you're not careful, can be dangerous since you can accidentally close it onto your hand. Not common, but I've seen people do it.
I've seen people do it with a locking blade just because they're not smart.
Yeah, people do a lot of really stupid stuff with knives, and I am no exception. I've had a few moments.
Oh, I would personally, with multi-tools, recommend going for a slightly larger, either Leatherman or just a larger Swiss Army, because the tiny ones tend to both have the worst blade quality and the worst durability.
So I actually have a rebuttal to that. So actually, the steel that is on so the stainless steel on a Swiss Army knife specifically is 4116. It's actually a very high quality steel. It is very thin, which again kind of goes into that durability aspect. But the actual blade itself, or the blade steel itself, is incredible. It's an incredible stainless steel. I personally think that I think that yeah, I do agree with William though. If you're gonna go with the multi tool, get one that's got a lot of things on it. They are going to be best, I think, for people who have, if you want to have one tool that will do all of it and will work with all of your equipment, a multi tool is the best way to go. If you're a hiker or something like that, a multi tool, just go multi tool.
And one thing to throw in there, a lot of people with Swiss Army knives just think of the style of knife, like when it comes to Band-Aids, how Band-Aid is actually the brand. When we say a Swiss Army knife, we mean the actual brand one, because there are a lot, and I mean a lot of cheap knockoffs. I owned one and it was trash.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about Swiss Army knives, we do mean the brand because those ones are far superior to all their counterparts.
So, when you're going into knives in general, it is important to look at your knife laws, as these can vary from state to state and can have rules on including what counts as a dangerous weapon. So, for example, you have more of the weapon and dirk daggers, but also sometimes blade length can be a big factor, especially in your state and local laws. This could be your greater than 5 inches, was an example for one of them. If you want to find more info on your state, look up the American Knife and Tool Institute and state knife laws. They have essentially kind of a primer on the various laws on each state in the US. Again, other countries are different, but know your laws before you're carrying or using knives.
So William did mention blade shape, so I think we'll go right into that one. So blade, there's a lot of different types of blade shapes, and they're all designed for completely different purposes. Although all of them can pretty much do the same basic things. So let's kind of dive just right into it. So probably one of the most popular blade shapes available these days is what's called the clip point. Now, what that in the old days, what that meant is that you essentially took a chisel and you chopped off the edge of or like basically the point of the blade so that you could just better hammer it out in the forging process. That's where the term clip point comes from. But essentially, what it really means is that the point is kind of swept up above the center of the knife blade itself. So generally, that might mean that the tip is right up on the end of the knife, or is maybe curved up a little bit. And these are going to be very common on hunting knives and very much general purpose blades. Probably the best example of a good clip point would be something like a K-bar knife, like from World War II, and like Bowie knives. They all use clip points. These are going to, in general, a clip point is going to allow greater control with a larger blade for more delicate tasks, as the clip point actually allows you to get up a lot higher on the blade to get a lot more control. So if you're doing something like skinning an animal, or you're cutting like vegetables or something, you can get much greater control with a clip point blade per the length of the blade itself. Another kind of common one that is becoming very popular nowadays is drop points. So a lot of people often mistake drop points as what's called a spear point. They're kind of in the same realm, but essentially the idea is that the point of the blade is generally a lot more centralized with where your thumb is. And these are going to be very good general purpose blades that are far more modern. They're going to be good as a jack of all trades, but not really a good master of any. They're very popular these days, though, so they're kind of the typical what you get when you buy a good quality knife these days. I will admit that from my experience, I have found that a drop point tends to be something that you want to have a shorter blade to offer you a bit more control. A lot of people build them to be a bit larger then people probably can control, and it just becomes a big problem. So one of my favorite designs, in fact, actually my Kershaw that I carry every day is of this type, is what is called a sheepfoot or a Wernicliffe style blade. Again, I'm just putting this to a very broad category. The leak is that my Kershaw is actually not technically one of these two, but it's almost the same in concept. But essentially what it is it is a flat box cutter blade. So it's basically a straight blade with a downswept point. These are very, very practical for like daily tasks, like opening boxes, opening letters, cutting, scribing lines, whittling, and all those kinds of tasks, because you have a straight blade that's very, very strong and it doesn't have any extra length. Okay. So it's actually very, very controllable as well. So these are definitely going to be really good for people who have a lot less active lifestyles, that you might want to just have a very much so more of a light duty or very heavy duty blade that is going to be used for normal stuff. And the final is one that we're going to talk about, just kind of to round off multiple different types of blades, is a very general concept of what I am going to just call a reverse point. Basically, these are really good. These are like, think of like a karambit, if you've ever seen one of those, or like a gardening knife or something, where essentially the point is swept under, like a sickle, essentially. And the idea behind these is that these are really, really good for things like cutting rope, brush, gardening, farm work, and like other tasks where having a curved blade that goes downward, where you are going to be basically cutting, where you're basically going to be ripping, like what I would just basically call pulling the blade to you, or to get power. These are going to be probably the best design for those kinds of tasks. I actually think that they're pretty good. In fact, I've used them a few times, and they're very, very nice to use. But these are a pain in the butt to try and carry. If you try and find a folding knife version of one of these, good luck. If you can find one for like sub $100, you're doing really good.
And then next we have blade size. An important thing to note is that getting a blade that's too small or too big will make using the knife difficult. And a knife that's difficult to use is a knife that's dangerous, as it's a lot easier to have accidents when you're struggling to either control or properly use the knife. Generally, the right blade size for you can be determined by finding the distance between your knuckle and then the fingertip of your pointer finger. Generally, this will be between 2 and 5 inches. Everyone has their own various recommendations.
For me, knife blades between about 2.5 and 3.5 inches are pretty much best for me. And for those of you who have monstrous hands, I can guarantee you I probably have a hand size that's larger than yours, and I still think that a 3.5-inch blade is perfectly acceptable. In fact, maybe even a little bit long, unless you're using a fixed blade. Do you guys have any specific sizes that you guys like?
I've come to really like in between 3 to 4 inch knives. So it started when I was first in Scouts. We used to lay the knife like on our hand, and if it was bigger than your palm, you weren't allowed to have it in the troop. That was our rule, so that we'd keep the knife blades around the size that you are. But I got a 3 inch blade that was just as big as my palm, and so that made me happy, even though it was probably a little too big for my hand overall. But now that I've much grown into this knife, because I've been using it for years, I feel like it's the perfect like length for me, and I use it quite often. So mine's, I think, 3 1/4 to be exact.
I've you do make a good comment about the knife blade being the size of the palm. That is another way you can test it. I always forget about that method too.
And that's for folding knives specifically, or at least for my troop, it was.
Folding knives, yeah. So that's a good way to test it. That's about the maximum length. In fact, truth be told, a smaller blade will be more controllable. So if you don't be afraid to get like a 2.6 or 2.7 inch blade. I like 2.5 to 3.5 personally. I've got massive hands, and I still think that a smaller blade is better. So finally, let's kind of get into the cost of a blade and what you should be looking at. Is this something that you're going to want to spend a ton of money on, or is this something that you're going to want to maybe go a little bit cheaper? Well, it's very complicated, but you can simplify it down in a few ways. If you want really good steel and you want really good performance, put the money down. If you want something that'll get the job done and maybe a little bit more chaotic, like more annoying to just like sharpen every once in a while to maintain all of that, you can go for a pretty cheap knife. I will say though that you can buy a really good knife for $10. You can buy a really good knife for $20. You can buy a really, really good knife for $40 or $50. You don't have to spend all that much money on knives. That is the reality of it. There are a couple of really good companies that have been around for really, really long times that also are not made in America that make really, really good knives. For example, I made a mention of Mora. I think I made a mention of the company Moraniv. They're a Swedish company. They've been making knives for about 120 years, and they basically build what are called pukos, which are a Norwegian designed knife that is overwhelmingly simple. I actually decided to buy one for work, and I've been very impressed with it. I bought this one for $10. It's called the Basic 511. You can buy them on Amazon for less than $15, and it's a fixed blade, granted, but it's really, really nice. It's very lightweight. It comes with a good sheath that actually clips in. You can clip it into your pocket or a belt buckle. It's only about 8 inches long overall, which is actually really kind of nice, especially when you're putting it on a life jacket for like where I work. And overall, a really, really good deal. Another company that you might be able, there's a lot of these like more European companies that make more what we call peasant knives. Like, for example, French company Opnal makes the Opnal number 8, number 6, 7, all of those. They're basically just an 1890s design that is super simple and is actually really, really nice. Is it a heavy duty knife? Absolutely not. Don't try and beat this thing with a hammer trying to cut open a coconut. Don't do that. It's not worth your time. You'll break the knife before you get there. But it's a folding cooking style knife, and you can buy them for $15. And they're nice. They're pretty comfortable. I'm actually holding my brother Parker's because he wanted to get a really good knife, and he just grabbed an Opnal, and he loves it to death. It's got a good handle, all of that for $15. It comes with good steel too because it's really, really simple. A little bit more expensive. I mean, I bought my Kershaw Leek, which generally sells between about $50 and $100 depending. I was able to get mine for $41, and it comes with good Sandvik steel that is really easy to sharpen. So you don't have to spend a ton of money on a knife to get a really good one. The other thing is, don't be afraid to consider the concept of maybe building a knife from scratch. It will require more equipment and stuff, but I have actually done it a few times from kits. If you're going to do it, I recommend doing it from a kit because it's really hard to build one in actuality from the ground up. I've found that out the hard way multiple times. But, you don't have to spend a ton of money. You don't have to spend even $50. You can go pretty cheap and get really good quality that I can guarantee you will work out just fine for your purposes. That being said, companies like Gerber, Buck, Kershaw, any other Swiss Army will sell you pretty decent quality knives for really cheap, like sub 50 or $75. Couple of big things though. Get good steel. Just get good steel and get a properly built blade, and you'll do whatever it takes to get that.
Yeah, so been through in quite a few recommendations, and I just kind of want to give my final recommendation. And it is the knife that I've referenced at least 3 times throughout this. It's a Ruko, like 3.25 inch blade. I think I paid $30 for it when I got it. It's not bad. I looked it up and I found it on Fleet Farm for $20 if you decide to get the lime green version instead of the hunting one that I got, the camo, because I thought that was cool as a kid. But I think it's a really great starting knife because, again, earlier I said uh, it has an easily sharpenable edge. It holds up quite well. And in the handle, it even has some grip tape. So you can grip it pretty well in case you're pushing harder on something or you just can't hold it that well. I think it's a great starting knife. And it also will teach you to take care of knives because it does lose an edge quicker than some other knives. It can get dinks in it and stuff like that. And the paint on mine has started peeling, so it's basically just a silver knife now. Um, but yeah, it's a 3.25 inch blade of 440A stainless, and I think it's a pretty great everyday carry. And it's got a lock in it, so you won't mess up your finger because it doesn't lock or something like that.
I think my final recommendation. I made a couple of recommendations, but I'm gonna just kind of say my final recommendation just because of my experiences with it. Um, Kershaw's the Kershaw Leak that I own, I really like for daily carry stuff. So I will recommend it. Again, it will cost you a bit more. It'll be about 40 or $50, but I can guarantee you this is probably one of the most solid built knives I've ever felt. It's by far the most solidly built that I've ever seen at this price range. So that's really nice to report. But otherwise, if you're looking for a fixed blade, I recommend looking at either a Mora because they're really cheap. You can find them really cheap on Amazon, like 15, like $10 to $30 for multiple different models. If you want a fixed blade that is going to have a carbon steel blade that actually, from my own experiences using mine at work, holds up really well, even to very brutal environments like lake water. So those really are my two recommendations. Will, do you got any?
Not really. I honestly just go with the Swiss Army if you're just starting out. It's one that's not complicated. It's relatively cheap. And as someone who isn't big into knives and who only, I use a multi-tool to do some basic cutting and just some basic camp use, that's really all I've needed. A folding knife is great when you're doing some more intense use, but on the majority of my outdoors work and experience, just a simple Swiss Army is all I needed.
I'm gonna double down. If you want a multi-tool, get a Swiss Army knife. Get a Victorinox Swiss Army. I agree with William from my own experience with them. I don't have a ton, but they're just really practical to have. They're actually surprisingly lightweight. They've got a good blade. They hold their edge a long time. They've got all sorts of extra little goodies on them that you'll find very helpful in day-to-day life. That's probably my third recommendation, really. Just a Swiss Army.
12th recommendation.
12th recommendation. Sorry, I apologize.
Alrighty, this has been a day for adventure. Next time, we'll be going over how to get into canoeing. For now, if you have your own knife recommendation, leave it in the comments of our YouTube channel. Otherwise, this has been a day for adventure. Get off your butt, get outside, and have a fantastic adventure.